Welcome to this recording which looks at cost behaviour and cost summaries. By cost behaviour we mean the way in which costs are affected by changes in the level of activity. So costs can behave in many ways and they can combine several typical behaviours. The ones that we're going to look at are a fixed cost, a stepped cost, a variable cost and a semi-variable cost. Now a fixed cost is a cost which is expected to remain fixed over a period of time, typically up to 12 months. So irrespective of how output changes, the cost remains the same. If such a cost was plotted on a graph, as we can see here, we have the level of activity and we have the cost. And irrespective of the level of activity, whether it be 0 or upwards of 0, the cost has remained the same. So we have a horizontal line. Typical examples of a fixed cost are things like the rent on a building. Once you enter into an agreement to rent your building, irrespective of the number of units you produce, your rent is not going to change in that agreed period. Another example can be salaries. So if you've joined a company and you're being paid a salary of 30,000 a year, then irrespective of the hours that you work, your salary will remain at 30,000 for that year. So it's not affected by activity. You can also come across another type of fixed cost which is referred to as a stepped fixed cost. And you can see the reason for this is that it does increase in steps. What happens with a stepped cost is that it does remain the same up to a particular level of activity, after which it increases and then remains the same again, up to the next level of activity, and so on. So an example of this again could be rent. This could be the rent of your first building or your first warehouse, after which you've got so much output you need to take on a second warehouse, so your overall rent increases and then stays the same until your output gets to a level where you need a third warehouse. So it's fixed up to a certain output range, then it increases and remains fixed at that new level. So both of those are fixed costs. The other type of cost that you will come across is a variable cost, and the variable cost varies directly with the level of activity. And if we look at the graph, we've got the level of activity on the x-axis and we've got the cost on the y-axis. When there is 0 level of activity, there is 0 cost. As the level of activity increases, so the cost increases in direct proportion. Examples of this could be things like your direct material or your direct labour. A variable cost is fairly easy to recognise in that when it is quoted, it will often be quoted as a cost per unit, or a cost per kilo, or a cost per hour. So the more units that are produced, so the cost increases. Finally, we have a semi-variable cost. Now, a semi-variable cost is made up of a fixed and a variable component. And if we look at this one on the graph, we can see that it is partly like a variable cost. However, whereas a variable cost started at the origin, this line starts partway up the y-axis. Where it actually starts is your fixed costs. Now we need to be able to split a semi-variable cost into the fixed and the variable element, so that we can then use those figures for forecasting what our costs are likely to be at different levels of output. There's three methods of separating the fixed and the variable components, and that's the scatter graph method, the least squares method of regression analysis, and the high-low method. We will look at regression analysis later in a future video, so for the moment I'm going to look briefly at the scatter graph method, but the most important one is the high-low method. So starting with the scatter graph method, we need to draw a graph. So we have some data here. We have different levels of output in units and the costs that correspond with those level of outputs. They have been drawn on the graph, and then a line of best fit. This line then is taken through to the y-axis, and where the line actually cuts the y-axis is the fixed cost. So we have the fixed cost here. There's our fixed cost. So once we know the fixed cost, we can then work out the variable cost. So from this graph, the line cuts the y-axis at £1,300. So therefore we think our fixed cost is £1,300. So now if we go to any of our levels of output, so for example if we choose the 200 units, our total cost, so that's the fixed and the variable together, is 3,500. We've identified from the graph that our fixed costs are 1,300. So if we deduct 1,300 from 3,500, the difference is the variable cost. So 3,500 minus 1,300 gives us £2,200. So our variable costs are £2,200. Now that's based on 200 units. So if we then divide it down, that tells us our variable costs £11 per unit. Now note here, as I said earlier, our variable costs are quoted on a per unit basis or per kilo or per hour, whereas our fixed costs are quoted for the period. So that's the scatter graph method. However, the main problem with the scatter graph method is that it's been drawn by eye to get a line of best fit, and therefore it is inaccurate. So a better method, and a method that you need to become very familiar with, is the high-low method. So here we have an example of a company with different levels of activity over 6 months of the year and a cost that is incurred at each level of activity. Now if we look at those costs, we can see that they are changing as the activity level changes. So therefore we know that that is not a fixed cost because it's changed. But how do we know that it's not a variable cost if we weren't told? The way to find out is to work out the cost per unit. So if we divide 36,600 by 1,800, so we're going to divide that by 1,800, that tells us what the cost per unit is, which is £20.33. Now if we do it again at another level of activity, so let's take February, 41,150 divided by 2,450, that gives me £16.80 a unit. And this is what tells me it is not a variable cost. because with a variable cost, the cost per unit should be the same. When we talk about varied, we're talking about the cost varying in total. So for this to be a variable cost, at each level of activity, the cost per unit should have worked out the same, but it hasn't. So that means it is not a variable cost. We know it is not a fixed cost, so therefore we assume it is a semi-variable cost. And we need to know what the fixed and the variable part is. Now the high-low method, there's an indication as to how to do it in the name. We look at the highest level of activity, which is February, and the cost that goes with that. And then we pick out the lowest level of activity, which is May, and the cost that goes with that. So high-low means take the highest level of activity and the corresponding cost, take the lowest level of activity and the corresponding cost. So that's what we have here. Highest level of activity and the cost, lowest level of activity and the cost. We then take the one away from the other and we get a difference of 700 units and a difference of £4,900. These two figures are then used to work out the variable cost per unit. We divide the 4,900 by 700. So that's the change in the costs divided by the change in the units. And that gives us a variable cost of £7 per unit. We now need to work out the fixed cost. So we go back to either level of activity. We can choose the February level or we can choose the May. We will get the same answer. So let's take the February level of activity. The total cost is 41150. So total cost 41150. So that's here. We know the variable cost is £7 a unit. So for 2,450 units, which is the February activity, our variable cost would be 2,450 times 7, which gives us this 17150. The difference, therefore, is the fixed cost of 24,000. So there is our fixed cost. So we know variable costs £7 a unit, fixed costs 24,000. Now just to prove that we could have used either level of activity, I'm now going to do the same calculation using the May figures. So the total cost at May was 36250. The variable cost is the number of units in May, 1,750, times £7 per unit, gives us 12250. The difference in them two figures is the fixed cost, which is 24,000. So exactly the same as we had worked out. And this is what we would expect, because a fixed cost is a cost that remains fixed irrespective of the output. So whether we have 1,750 units or whether we have 2,450 units, the fixed cost remains the same. So it remains at £24,000. We can use this information to forecast. So we know our variable cost is £7, we know our fixed costs are 24,000. So what would be the expected total cost if we were to produce 2,300 units. Well, each unit would cost us £7 in variable costs, so 2,300 times 7. So that gives us 16,110. We would incur the fixed costs, which would be 24,000. So our total cost, two of those figures added together, £40,100. So we've got a forecast. We can say, what if? What if we produce 2,300 units? Well, then we can expect the cost to be £40,100. Just a reminder, fixed costs and variable costs. Right, the fixed costs in total we expect to remain the same over a reasonable level of output and a reasonable period of time. It doesn't mean that they will stay the same indefinitely. For example, if your fixed cost is rent, every year you're likely to see a rent increase. So it's probably going to stay the same for 12 months, then it will go up and stay the same again for the next 12 months. Similarly, a variable cost, it remains the same per unit, but again, not indefinitely. For example, labour can be a variable cost. You may be paying labour at £15 an hour, and it will stay at £15 an hour, but not indefinitely, because your workforce will expect a pay increase. So it may go up in 12 months' time to £11.50 an hour. So although they remain the same, it's not indefinite. So you just need to bear that in mind. Right, the last thing I just want to briefly mention is a cost summary. This is a way of pulling together all the costs that are incurred in producing our products. So that would be all your direct costs and all your indirect costs. Now there is a particular order in which you would present these costs, and that is the cost summary layout that we're going to look at. We always start with our direct costs. So we would look at the direct cost of material, the direct labour cost, and then the direct expenses. Those are added together to give us the prime cost. Then we would look at our indirect costs. So those are the other costs that are incurred but cannot be directly related to our product. Those indirect costs, in the cost summary, we split between those which we consider production and those which we consider non-production. So under the production overheads, we would have things like factory rent, or the foreman's salary, or the factory heat and light. So everything to do with production generally takes place within the factory. When we've added those costs, or overheads as they can be referred to our prime cost, we have what is known as the production cost. Then, to get the total cost, we add all our other overheads. So these are overheads that are incurred elsewhere in the organisation. So these could be our selling and distribution overheads. It could be the administration overheads. It could be the finance overheads. So we gather together all of those non-production overheads, add them to the production cost, and we have the total cost. So that's the layout of the cost summary, which you will need to be aware of. So that brings us to the end of this recording, and as I said, you do need to be familiar with the content, in particular the being able to recognise cost behaviour and being able to use the high-low method for separating out the costs. So thank you for listening.